This is The Hypothesis, the show where industry experts debate and discuss growth marketing approaches, digital advertising tactics, measurement plans, as well as creative and growth strategies.
Hi, I'm Phil Ware, VP of Strategy at Thrive Digital.
And I'm Eric Sloan, VP of Data and Strategy at Thrive Digital.
And I'm your moderator, lay marketer, and asker of clarifying questions, Santana Blanchett. Hi, friends, and welcome to this week's episode of The Hypothesis. We are joined by a very special guest, Tyler Power. He is our Director of Creative Services. As you've probably heard over our last few episodes, we've talked a lot about how important creative is to stand out as our ability to target diminishes. So today we're diving headfirst into one of two creative-focused episodes this season. So today's hypothesis is that ugly ads are more effective than polished ones. So to get right into the topic, let's talk about performance creative versus other types of creative. So when we say performance creative, how does it differ from like brand or other areas? And I'll ask you first, Tyler.
Brand creative is an awareness tactic, an awareness execution. It's all about positioning your brand in the hearts and minds of your audience. We use a quote often in some of our brand onboarding decks that brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. So I think brand creative is very much that. It's creating that like positive sentiment in your audience so that they have a certain feeling about your brand when they're not engaged with it. I think brand creative typically, and could be considered a blanket statement, but appears in sort of traditional platforms and executions like your television spots, your radio, your print collateral, things of that nature. Performance creative, on the flip side of that, is a complement to brand creative, but I think it is more reliant upon data. I think the methodology when it comes to performance creative is very rooted in historical performance in digital channels and digital tactics. You have the ability in performance creative to test and optimize and iterate on things based on the data that you have at your fingertips. I also think performance creative offers you a more economical arena for that type of testing. So you can learn a lot of things about your creative that you may not be brave enough or have the budgets to sort of test in those more traditional brand platforms. So that's where I kind of make the distinction.
Awesome.
It's really interesting, Tyler. Do you see that you could have a piece of brand creative that could play in both arenas? It just depends on how that creative is cut up and what CTAs you have, etc.
Yeah, for sure. And we see that a lot, right? Like, I think part of our superpower here is to take some of that brand creative and turn it into sort of lower funnel performance creative, right? We get our hands on like 30-second, 67-second spots, and we can sort of dissect that into different iterative creative executions based on, a brand message, based on feature benefit. We can test different hooks that we find in those different brand pieces and really like find that nugget in terms of performance. We have the luxury, I think, in performance creative, and I know we're going to get into the sort of ugly ad piece, but iterating quickly and finding out what works. And I think that's part of the power of the performance creative side of things. And we've seen, brand pieces perform very well on the performance creative side, but they're usually paired with something else, like to your point, like a hook or a CTA or a different USP. It can't just all be brand, because a lot of times where we're functioning is sort of in that consideration and conversion piece. So they need a reason, right? They can't just feel nicely about the brand. They kind of want to know something else, a reason why. And so I think the brand pieces always need to be paired with that sort of USP and that CTA.
I have a question about this because I've been sort of playing around with different ideas about like how, like where is this split, right? Because like kind of all creative needs to have some kind of performance, right? Like there needs to be some kind of reaction that you produce in the market, right? And so even brand creative, you're trying to generate awareness or these types of things. And I think measurement, modern marketing measurement has gotten to this place where we can measure a lot of these things using MMM or lift test, brand lift studies, like these types of things. But what I sort of keep coming back to is like performance creative is offer centric and brand creative is customer centric. And what I mean there is that when we have something that's offer centric, we come up with the offer and we throw it into these ad platforms, and then the ad platforms kind of decide what the audience is, right? So like we say, hey, we're going to target the entire US, or we're going to target like, this broad interest segment of the market. And then the machine learning within, Meta ads, Google ads, et cetera, are going to go out there and find the people that are going to click on that particular offer, right? So that's offer centric. And then customer centric is like you're trying to speak in some way directly to the consumer or whoever your customer is, and that may or may not produce any kind of action, right? So like it may produce them to click. That's obviously beneficial in some ways, but it may actually turn out that they just view it and move on. Is that kind of fair to say?
Yeah, I would say so. I also rely heavily on this quote that we say, to convert, you must first connect. So I'd say the performance piece is the conversion or the offer, right? That's where you're going to convert on the offer. And the brand piece is the connection piece. It's the emotive piece. It's that touchy feely piece, right? So that's also a nice way to make the distinction, the connection motion versus the conversion, the action.
I think, too, one follow up question that I want to ask everyone here is that I think the reason today that we need to distinguish between brand and performance creative is that we really don't want to suggest that your brand should be unpolished or ugly, or that we want to change that strategy necessarily. And so it's important to make to make the distinction very clear between performance and brand creative, because let's get into the why should performance creative occasionally be ugly? Why should it be unpolished? Or what do we mean when we say ugly creative? Let's start with that. What is ugly creative?
I can certainly take that one. My perspective on that is it is creative that is a departure from what you would expect from a given brand and isn't something that's really well polished, isn't scripted, it's raw, it's real, it's really showing like an emotional connection to a specific person who's talking about a brand or a product. So kind of think of it as like, UGC or creator driven assets, but a more raw version of that is more quick cuts. It's not got the perfect lighting. It's not scripted. It's really just real. So that's how I would look at ugly ads, is that they, on paper don't necessarily look the prettiest, but they really work. That's how I would kind of think of them. Tyler, I don't know if you've got a different opinion.
Probably the same thing. We're delving into the UGC territory. I think we would be naive to think that our audiences don't know that those are ads. But there's an emotional connection to them, right? Like people can associate themselves and relate themselves to those types of creators because for the most part, they're everyday human beings. And it's modern day product placement, but I think it's a bit more believable. It's tough though for some brands. Like, we work with a lot of brands that the expectation is polish. And they know that UGC is, a very effective tactic and trend that's pervasive across, the channels that we work in. But a lot of those brands aren't comfortable enough to harness that authenticity because they're so used to like having their brands be this sort of fragile little egg. They don't have the control that they normally do over this creative, and that makes them highly uncomfortable in some scenarios. Now, some brands are very open to it, and some brand standards and guidelines have sort of wider goalposts that allow for that type of experimentation, but we're still encountering a lot of brands that are just like, how do I polish this just a little bit more, or how do I control what they're saying just a little bit more, right? Because to my point earlier, like a brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room, and when they don't have the control around that position, there's definite amount of anxiety. And I think there's a time and place for the ugly ad, and it doesn't have to be your like be all and end all when it comes to your strategy, but it should be a part of it, right? You want to speak to the people on their level where they are. And I think UGC allows you a lot more access to a lot more different audiences. And I think there's a beauty and a magic in that unpolished nature.
Right.
And correct me if I'm wrong, so I guess this is a question statement, which is it feels like there's a piece here that we're missing about audience trust too. I think like we've been so inundated with ads over the past while from brands that I almost wonder if part of the appeal of like ugly ads and UGC at large is it almost mimics like a friendly referral, right? Like I think we've missed the piece of ugly ad where it's like ugly almost feels more trustworthy in some ways. Is that fair to say?
For sure. I think you're taking the airbrush off. Do you know what I mean? You're taking like those color corrections, the flaws out, and like sort of presenting the human side of advertising. So I would totally agree with that.
It's actually interesting because I remember talking about this subject 15 years ago, ugly versus sort of polished and all of that. I've been thinking for a long time about like, what is the mechanism there, right? Is it trust? Is it, or is it just pattern interrupt, right? And I think
Yeah.
from my perspective, that's a huge part of it, right? I mean, like you get a lot of brands producing, what they would consider to be sort of polished creative. And the unfortunate part, though, is that if all brands are highly polished, it becomes somewhat homogenous, right? And so like all ads look the same. And so then you produce a quote unquote ugly ad, and then suddenly that's a pattern interrupt. It stands out in your social feed, or it stands out when you're triggering an ad in YouTube, and suddenly that catches your attention because it looks more authentic. But I'm not 100% sold on this idea that it actually builds trust with the brand. Like I feel like it's a short-term impact, but not necessarily a long-term impact. And so coming back to this conversation about, offer centric versus customer centric, like are those ugly ads just offer centric? Are they a way of grabbing attention quickly, getting that click, getting that engagement? But are they actually also contributing to the sort of long-term value of the brand and the brand equity that you're trying to build with brand type campaigns? I'm not entirely sure about that.
I've seen some really interesting ads, on CTV that are clearly designed to be more of that awareness generation, consideration generation that have been more UGC. And like, I immediately made my eyes open because I was like, well, I'm not used to seeing, this more ugly ad on CTV. I'm used to seeing that on Instagram or on TikTok, but I'm not seeing that on CTV. So the pattern interrupt thing, Eric, like, I think there's something to that you are trying to like stand out from the crowd when we are all bombarded by ads constantly. So it is about trying to figure out how you can like stop the scroll, if you will, or capture that attention very, very quickly and get someone engaged in the brand. And I'm not entirely sold on the fact that like that UGC or ugly ad has to necessarily be off of focus, because like I'm talking about this ad now because it stood out to me, and this was clearly an awareness ad, and this was months ago that I saw it. So it's very much, I think, a case of how are you placing that ad in that specific medium, and are you trying to, as I said, like stand out from the crowd by doing so. So I can totally see your point around that kind of like pattern interrupt, but I'm not sold on the fact that that ugly ad has to be offer centric.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that also raises this like interesting point that there are some brands that just lean super hard into it, right? And where their entire brand is basically to be ugly, right? And that in itself is a pattern interrupt. And of course, that type of advertising is going to help that type of brand. But if you have like this, really polished brand that has been carefully curated over a long period of time, I can totally understand, this tension between, hey, yeah, maybe this UGC type of creative works, but is that really how we want consumers to think about us?
Mm-hmm. It's a challenge, especially for like the cosmetic or CPG space, where those are products that people are generally like using on their bodies, and they want to see how it looks in real life, and not just a airbrushed model who's been on $100,000 shoot in the desert, let's say.
Yep.
They want to see what it looks like in like their bedroom. So I think there's clearly a balance to be made between those two worlds, because some brands do want to appear luxury, but they also want to appeal to people in the real world and not be unattainable. So I think there's a play that those ads can have across the funnel.
So I guess it would be fair to distinguish and say that it's not necessarily ugly ads so much as it is less traditionally produced ads in many ways, right? Like we're not necessarily saying that it needs to be somebody in Microsoft Paint, more so that.
Although it could be.
It could be. I've seen some of those.
But
actually, this triggers a big question for me, especially in the context, Tyler, you mentioned earlier about like the emotional aspect of the creative too. And I've always thought, for example, that marketers in general, like transitioning over to digital from kind of traditional type of advertising, like there's an approach in traditional ads. You know, if you're going to create a TV ad, like you have more attention during that TV spot. You have more time. Maybe you have a 30-second spot, and you can tell a story, right? And so there's this storytelling aspect, and you're trying to elicit some kind of emotional response. But then translating that into like a Facebook ad, like a static Facebook ad, can be very, very difficult, right? And I'm not entirely sold on this idea that you can actually elicit an emotional response in that fraction of a second that someone looks at a static ad. And so I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this in terms of question, but I'm really curious about this like leap that marketers have made over the last, 15, 20 years of moving into digital advertising. And, can we actually maintain that emotional connection, or does it make more sense to sort of focus on the click, focus on maybe a very specific educational point in maybe a B2B sense or something like that, and just focus on a really specific goal of every one of those ads? Or is there actually still a point to doing emotional creative in the context of like social?
I think there is. We have the luxury of having access to different placements to test that. I always, when I'm talking to my team too, like, it's true, in the more traditional sense, in a TV spot, you have 30 seconds, sometimes 60 seconds to tell a story. Oftentimes, though, those are the hardest ads to make because you've got to fill that time and continue that story and keep them engaged, right? When we get into sort of the social and paid spaces, we're working with 30 seconds, 15 seconds, and 6 seconds. Can we still tell that same story? Can we still get that emotive response in those smaller time frames? One of the litmus tests that we do, though, often on the creative side when we're brainstorming is most people, it's funny, they think in multiple frames. Their idea comes to fruition in like a storyboard or in a 30-second spot. The litmus test for us is, does that idea still translate down to a static, right? And that's sort of like proves the efficacy and strength of a concept. I think if you need more time to make that connection and tell that story, it's a little less successful, I think, in the paid space. But like I said, we have access to those other placements and those other tactics, so we can still continue to do that. But yeah, we always gauge, the power of a concept based on our ability to communicate the same message, the same USP, answer the same pain point in a static as we do in a 30-second.
I guess a follow up to that is like, how much does context factor into that? Right. And so what I mean, for example, like if you're running TikTok creative, if you run something that's super polished, it's going to get skipped really fast, right? Because that's a bad form of pattern interrupt almost, right? Because it's so different from the rest of the feed that it just stands out as an ad, and people can spot it a mile away kind of thing, right? But how much of that context of like platform factors into that emotional response, where you sort of almost need to tweak that story for like what's around it versus just specifically telling the story for that particular brand?
Yeah, I think depending on platforms you're in, it definitely has to differ. You can't run a Facebook ad, and it's not going to be that Facebook ad isn't going to be as effective if you run it in Pinterest. It's not going to be as effective if you run it in TikTok. It's not going to be as effective if you run it in LinkedIn. It's not a one size fits all, right? Because there's different audiences on there and their expectations are different. So, that's another sort of litmus test for the concept is like, can we parlay this idea across all channels and still speak to those individual audiences and have it resonate? Because it's not just plug and play. right? You
Right.
really need to like understand the platforms and how people are engaging with that content on those different platforms to have, a highly effective and high performing ad.
Interesting.
I just have to say this too. Like the journalist in me wants to fight a little bit, Eric, here, because like when you look at photography as a medium, it can almost tell as much as a whole story, right? Like when you look at
Right.
one really well shot photo, that can almost give you as much as a whole story can. And I don't think that that is lost in advertising either. But to your point, it does depend on the medium and the need and all that stuff.
So first of all, that's a great point, but also the context matters, right? And so if you're looking at a photograph, it can absolutely elicit an emotional response, but what is the context of you looking at that photograph, right? Like are you actually meaning to think about it, or is it an ad that you just happen to be scrolling past as you're, scrolling your Facebook feed or your Instagram feed or what have you, right? And so can you elicit that emotional response in tiny fraction of a second, right? And I think you can in certain situations. I'm not saying that you can't. It's just how much of that translates from that kind of traditional way of thinking.
Yeah. And there's lots of other elements outside of just the image, right? And the visual. Like the visual hopefully stops them. It makes some sort of visual connection enough for them to stop for that second to gather more. And like, you know, it's digital advertising, but we still take traditional methodologies. Like it is the combination of image and words, and that combination is highly, highly important, right? So, in image copy paired with the visual gives that context. But in social platforms, we also have that description copy, which allows us to tell a little bit more story if we've now captured you. Headline copy that is probably going to support some sort of USP, some sort of promotion sale, or have a bit more of a brand message there. So we have these subtle little elements that support once we have you engage, and that helps, strengthen that sort of static concept and also supports a more storytelling vein for things that are dynamic or include motion or video.
Is it worth talking about? And sorry for all these questions, Tyler, but but I'm so excited about this conversation. Is it worth talking about the noise as well? Because like the just the noise of our everyday lives, I think factors into this idea of like ugly ads or pattern interrupt that we've been talking about, right? And so the most extreme times of the year, for example, like an ecom. From an ecom perspective, there's a ton of noise around Black Friday, and there's a ton of noise around big holidays and those types of things. That happens specifically for ecom, but there's also just more noise in general, right? We're exposed to more marketing messages. There's more scrolling. There's more apps that you can do scrolling on. There's all of these things, and everyone's fighting for that attention. And I feel like that's part of this conversation too, in that advertising needs to sort of break through that. And does that actually end up creating, more extreme advertising or uglier advertising, so to speak, right? Like just more of that pattern interrupt, and advertisers are just sort of searching for that.
I feel like at the point, in I guess the marketing calendars, when there is that noise, I feel that's when you rely more heavily on the brand stuff. You revert back to that, right? You hope that the brand advertising and the brand messaging and the brand awareness plays that you've put effort into prior to that start to come back into their mind. That I think that's the connection piece, right? People at those points in times are waiting for certain sales regardless. So if they're brand loyal, to someone, I think that's where the brand stuff plays an important role, is that, you've garnered those sentiments, that position in the hearts and minds of your audience prior to the noise, that's going to influence them to make a decision and sort of like filter through that noise at that point in time. Because you're right, there's just so many things out there. Save this much, right? BOGO, blah blah blah. But you're hoping that the brand stuff in your earlier efforts sort of remains with them when it comes to making that purchase decision. Because at the end of the day, it's hard. It's hard to fight through all of that, right? When you're inundated with like the volume of ads that you see in those times. But I kind of think that those people have made that decision before that, right? They're just waiting, and they're just making sure that they're saving enough money at that point in time to make that purchase. But they're usually still pretty loyal to the brands that they've always been loyal to.
So I want to take this back a little bit and ask this question specifically to Phil here, which is because you do have a lot of these new business conversations and you talk to a lot of our clients, so you have a good pulse on this. How would you say that marketers are currently thinking about performance creative specifically? So now that we've distinguished between brand and performance, how would you say a lot of businesses think about their performance creative right now?
It's a good question. I think when brands are generally thinking about that performance creative, they are more willing to test into that than I've seen throughout my kind of career at Thrive. And the reason for that, I think, is that because a lot of the other levers that we have to optimize these campaigns are somewhat disappearing over time, like very specific audiences, for example, the value of creative is really starting to shine through. But that being said, I think there's still more that brands could be doing to try and test into more robust testing methodologies around which performance creatives really could work for their audience, and being more experimental and getting uncomfortable with different creative concepts. And being uncomfortable is sometimes a part of marketing. Like, we need to push our own boundaries a bit in a brand safe way, but nonetheless be experimental. So that's essentially one of those things I've seen more frequently. Is there needs to be more of a push to start testing into these different creative concepts that they maybe haven't done before.
I don't want to move away yet from how people are currently doing things, because we will talk about in a minute here how they can be doing them better. But from your perspective, Tyler, when you get into those conversations about where performance creative is at now, what would you say that the kind of status quo is for how people are currently developing performance creative, or how they're thinking about it?
I think they're thinking about it in terms of their ability to test and optimize on creative. I often say, there is no such thing as a perfect ad. And in the performance realms, we're able to chase that perfection. But I think it's important also to get things out there and learn, so you are making good decisions based on performance and what's going to continue to perform. Our approach right now is oftentimes this champion versus challenger. If they have a historical legacy ads that we know are performing well, we're going to look at those, right? We're not going to throw those away. You don't scrap those because they're performing for a reason. And so we're going to take all the learnings that we can from what's out there and try and create something that's better, right? And sometimes we have a hunch, or a hypothesis, that this is going to work. This is going to crush this, and that old ad continues to outperform. And so we're always chasing for something that is going to become the champion. And once that becomes the champion, we put something else in its place. And so I think that's our approach. But we, like I said earlier, we have the luxury of being able to do that, right? We have the luxury of being able to do that very quickly. And in our scenarios and our approach, it's almost month over month. That's what we're trying to do. We're constantly trying to improve and optimize month over month and create a champion ad.
I think because we're already getting into this question, I'll just ask my next question then, which is, how can performance marketers make better creative? Because that seems to be what we want to talk about, which is like, what can the industry be doing better here? Or how do we make things better for our clients?
Invest in testing, invest in creatives that are net new. And I think what can happen here is people and brands get attached to a certain creative that's working, or a creative theme that's working, and then they iterate on that to eke out an additional extra 10% of performance or whatever it may be. But they lose sight of what else is out there? Like, what else could I be doing that might work 20% better than the current theme I'm working on? So that's where I see sometimes this bit of a gap start to form, where there's this comfort zone that develops around creative and a certain style that works, and that you kind of get the blinders on to these other elements that work. Some of the other kind of elements to consider and think about is, well, engage your user base. So your user base, if you have a really strong brand and you've got people who are engaging with your product, they are probably talking about it on social media too. So how can you engage that user base and that customer base to record ads or record video that they would probably be thrilled to be a part of in terms of that turning into an ad? So there is a real robust source of raw content there that you could start iterating on and turn into ad. So there's a lot of things there that I think brands could be doing more of, and it doesn't have to be like bank breakingly expensive to go and shoot, $200,000 spot or whatever it may be. There's a lot of ways that brands could really invest in creative and do it somewhat cheaply, around getting some of that raw kind of ugly ad creative.
So from my perspective, for performance creative specifically, I think it's speed. Just move faster. And I think the way that performance marketing teams can integrate that into their workflow is to actually measure the speed at which they're getting new creative into market, right? And you want to iterate fast, you want to test fast. Don't wring your hands about every little change kind of thing. If you look at these big content creators on YouTube, especially, they're just testing so many different thumbnails for their videos and all of that kind of stuff because the smallest change, there's no way that you can sit down and precisely pick what small change is going to boost your engagement in the short term. And so the answer is just pushing out volume and moving as fast as you can. And I think that the performance teams that actually measure how fast they're moving and almost turn that into a KPI are going to be successful in that space too. This is specifically for performance creative though, right? Where you're trying to measure the performance of what's happening in your campaigns, not more of a brand type creative where you're looking for those long-term effects, right? Because you just can't move as fast in that space because you're not getting feedback quick enough.
I think speed too is probably would be indicative of ugly ads too. You just don't have the time to
True,
publish, right?
yeah.
It's like MVP. Like the production person in me would be scared of the speed because of the volume that you would have to do, and the designer in me is like, ugh, like the minutia details. But we only have a split second to engage with those people, and so I think speed and volume is an interesting theory. The other thing I think is there's an education component to what we do, right? And because I mentioned earlier, a lot of the brands we work with are very, very protective over their brand. And they're not willing to take those big swings and be bold and brave with their brand because they're just too scared of what might happen or what the fallout of it is. And oftentimes when we're producing ads and ad concepts, we understand this, right? We always produce around 3 to 5 ad concepts. The first one we present is always very close to what they have and what they're used to and what they're comfortable. And we slowly step them away to like ad concept 5, which is like totally out of the box. It's very unusual that we would go for ad concept 5, but it acts as a barometer in terms of like what we can potentially do for them. They end up somewhere in the middle there, or a Frankenstein version of 3 and 4, but then we get a very good idea of like their comfort level in terms of how bold and brave they want to do. And sometimes that concept 5 is an uglier version of a polished ad, but there's something in there that we know, or we have a hunch that is going to work based on what we've done. We also take on a process when we go through a creative strategy that we call motivators and barriers. And we identify motivators, something that will motivate our audience to convert, to purchase, to buy, to become a lead. And then a barrier is something that stands in their way. And often some of the most interesting stuff is the barriers, right? Those sort of like negative aspects or negative sentiments of the brand that we can attach a USP to almost be preemptive in answering a pain point. And so, we try and work that into our concepting and our messaging and our creative strategy. And sometimes those are those more braver, uglier pieces, like a barrier concept could be owning a poor testimonial, right? So you get a poor testimonial on Reddit and you own that. You're like, we're aware of that and we're fixing this. A lot of brands aren't willing to glom onto a negative testimonial and be like, yeah, we hear you, we see you, and this is what we're doing. A lot of brands would glom onto a positive testimonial. We see that as a pervasive theme throughout a lot of what we do in terms of social proof, right? But that's kind of like the juxtaposition of that. Why not own that sort of negative that negative shout out and be like, we hear you, we see you, and this is what we're doing to change that.
One of my favorite campaign examples recently was there is a beauty brand that had one particular, they launched one of their most popular products in a new fragrance. And somebody on Reddit was saying about how this particular fragrance was attracting wolf spiders. And it was completely ludicrous, but it really picked up speed. And so for April Fool's Day, the brand made a whole like campaign joking about it, about how they made like a specific fragrance just to attract spiders and like spiders guaranteed. And it was great. And it had so much traction because it was just so ridiculous and they leaned into it. It was fantastic. And so to your point, I think like Eric talks about this all the time, and I think it's what makes the three of you so great at your job, which is listen to your customers, because even when it's ridiculous, there's still great source of inspiration there.
It's funny, that you say that, the wolf spiders. The April Fools ads are usually in organic, are usually brands like Time to be a little bit more playful, but those see a ton of engagement, right? Just because it's like it's a bit more tongue in cheek. Like I used to work for a chip brand, and April Fools was always their favorite time to play around. And then we did a couple campaign or a couple of pieces of creative. One of them was like the chip flavors were the scents of the candles, or we had electrolyte flavoring for water and it was the flavors of the chips. And they're never as brave they would probably never be as brave as to like implement that into a campaign. But when they have sort of these organic occasions to do that, they see a ton of uptick in engagement. Like, why not test that, right? What do you got to lose?
I actually have a question around this, and because what this reminds me of is almost content marketing, right? I mean, like you're trying to you're creating engagement about something that is not necessarily an offer, right? And it's not necessarily branding either. It is sort of, because like you're engaging in a certain way between the brand and the consumers. But there's a new term for an old concept, which is zero click content, right? And that's essentially where the whole point of your promoted ad or your promoted post in a context of like meta ads or even YouTube, social platforms, etc., is to just get a message across. The point is not to get a click or anything like that, but it's, hey, we're going to educate our addressable market on this particular subject, and so we're going to promote this ad, which just has some educational content, and that's that, right? And so instead of creating a blog post or something like that, you're actually moving that content to the social feed, and then you're promoting it. And so it is kind of advertising, but it's also content marketing, but it's also branding. And I'm just curious what you all think about that, especially Santana, like being in the content space and all of that. Like that's, I think, an old form of advertising that has gotten new life and new energy. And I'm really excited about it because I think as a consumer myself, like there's a lot of cases where I don't want to click. I want to just learn something, teach me something about your brand, and then let me move on. I'm in the context of that social platform and not in the context of wanting to click.
Tyler and I talk about this all the time, actually, where we often talk about it under the lens of his kids, but the ad is the content nowadays, right? The content is the ad, right, and the ad is the content, and they don't know the difference. Like back in the day, we'd watch a TV show and you'd know what the commercials are, but between product placement and YouTube videos or this content you see online, like zero click content, you're kind of hiding the vegetables in the dish. And so it's really hard nowadays to know if you're doing it well. I would say which is which. Like I want to build positive brand sentiment in a way that you enjoy. So how do we do that? And I think that's absolutely a big thing now, but I'll let Tyler talk about the creative side of that.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring this up. And yes, Santana and I do talk about this a lot. I watch my kids a ton. And I try and minimize screen time and things like that, but you can't just eliminate it fully. And so I watch them on YouTube, and it's somewhat difficult to see because they are immersed in advertising the whole time they're there, and they don't even know it. So much so that when they actually see an ad, they're like, "What the hell is that?" Like for the first time in 10 years, I have cable, and so they're seeing television spots, and they're almost enamored with it because it's so foreign to them, but they don't know that they basically live their lives in ads, whether they're on YouTube watching their favorite creator or their favorite influencer, whether they're playing a game in Roblox that's sponsored by a brand that wants access to our little ones. And so it's very much hidden now in their everyday lives, right? And at some point, we're talking about these ugly ads. I feel like with everything, it's going to be cyclical, right? I think at some point we probably end up going back to the polish because, to your point, that's what sort of now disrupts our feeds, right? It becomes thumb stopping because everything is UGC right now, and we're naive to think like that these aren't ads. We're kind of like voluntarily pulling the wool over our eyes. But I do think that at some point we probably end up back at some sort of polished advertising, or, and Phil, you and I have already started to see this a little bit, this amalgamation of UGC and brand, where brands work with more polished creators to infuse their brand in almost like a subtle and subliminal way. And so they're still thematically, creating UGC, but having more curation and control over it.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to provide a bit of that direction around what that needs to look like. And I also think consumers are slowly becoming aware of like what's authentic and like what's not, and people can very much see through that now. I think
Yeah.
early doors UGC, like it was a new thing and everyone was like, oh, like this is great, these people are really talking about the brand, whereas now I think it's a lot more known that like there is clearly some incentive for these people to be talking about
Yes.
XYZ brand. So I think there's somewhat of a realization of that amongst the user base, and doing that tastefully needs to be a kind of core part of what these brands are doing when they do create these ugly ads, is just being aware of doing it well.
It's interesting because like this whole conversation has kind of struck me as a bit of a tangled mess, right? Like the content is the ad and the ad is the content, but sometimes the content and the ad are someone else's content, and sometimes it's a static, but sometimes it's a video, and sometimes you make the video. Like it's just a creative tangled heap of like the junk drawer wire ball you pull out.
It totally is, right? Like, obviously motion and video are a huge part of what we do. And we build our teams and gear our strategy to be inclusive of that. Right now, I don't know why, but we're seeing in a lot of instances statics outperform video. Like, trying to predict the future of digital marketing performance creative is, how long is a piece of thread? Like, it's just, it's almost impossible. You can jump on trends, and much like people are doing with UGC, but at some point, something else is going to replace that, and whether that's a sort of a relapse back to, the old ways of doing things, or it's an amalgamation, like I said, a Frankenstein of what's working now and, brand advertising. Who knows? That I think that's kind of the exciting part of it, right? Is like to see where it goes, and to see what the organic evolution of our industry is. It keeps you on your toes. It keeps it exciting. It generates new ideas every day, and like we've talked about, we have the ability in these platforms to test all those things. So why not test them all?
100%. Like I think the thing we always say about growth marketing is that it's a mixture of art and science. But when you think about the creative element, it is the art side of things very, very clearly. And yes, we can infuse data into decision making, but it's still the ideation that humans have as a part of that process that break through, and that really start to think about XYZ campaign differently. That's what sets that apart. So making sure that people are still very clearly ideating on like what is just different and stands out. That's what the future looks like. And where I could kind of see things moving is that humans are still kind of being that source of ideation and really thinking about these concepts, but maybe there's some AI infused into cutting up those ads differently for what a specific user might want to see as a result of that ad. And so the ad concept is still, very much created around what humans, think about and ideate, but they are personalized to some degree. based upon what these automated ad algorithms with PMAX or ASC or whatever it may be are going to be slicing those ads slightly differently for us in the future that are more attuned to what a Santana might want to see or a Tyler, and be very much attuned to what's going to capture your attention versus 20,000 other users just like you.
So I agree with both of you on all of that, and y'all are probably gonna get tired of me saying this in the podcast, but follow the customer is kind of what it comes down to, right? And I think that this has worked in the past; it will work in the future. No matter how much technology we throw at advertising, no matter how much segmentation and machine learning algorithms and all of these pieces we use to sort of optimize the message to the customer at the right time and all of those things, no matter what we throw at it, following the customer is always going to be a good idea. It's always going to result in better advertising. It's going to result in better user experiences. It's going to result in better targeting. It's going to result in just better strategy in general, right? And so I think learn as much as you can about your market and follow what they want, follow the buying process that they want, follow the types of messages that they want, the objections that you need to handle, follow all of that. And I think you can't go wrong as long as you're following the customer.
That's a wonderful place to wrap up on, but I have one last question that if I don't ask, it's going to wake me up in the middle of the night tonight, because I feel like it's a giant hole in this episode, which is for a group of people that so frequently tell me that testing is so important and that tests take time, for y'all to say it's the speed at which you pump it out. I have to know what is the mixture of like speed to market with bad creative, and how do you factor in testing? Like, I know that that's a big question for the time we have left, but it feels like a bit of a hole.
I think for me, it's responsiveness to results, right? Like, the results that you might get from a test, may be very directional as to we need to do more of X, Y, Z. Doing X, Y, Z, that should happen quickly. That shouldn't necessarily be like, it's going to take us 3 months to go and like develop what that new test is. I think it's just the iteration that needs to be done at speed versus just like pumping out ads for the sake of pumping out ads. I think it needs to be deliberate and focused on test outcomes basically. So that's where I would kind of have a flavor to that question. Santana is like very clearly balancing what you're producing and that being the result of good decision making, I suppose, and doing that at speed versus just being a dam letting go of like hundreds of assets at a moment in time, because it's going to take a long time to test all of that.
Yeah, and there's a difference also between testing by putting stuff out in the market and sort of letting a platform like Meta Ads kind of tell you what's working by what it's pushing into the market, right? So one way of testing, for example, and this is, I might bother some statisticians here, but if you throw a bunch of ads into a platform like Meta Ads is going to optimize towards the ones that are getting the most engagement and sort of like are most likely to get you the more of whatever you're optimizing towards. If that's purchases, it will be sort of geared in that direction, right? And so that also is a form of testing. It's not so rigorous that you're running a proper hypothesis test and all of that, because that does certainly take time, and you should reserve those types of more sophisticated tests for the big swings, so to speak, right? And so the testing big creative themes and those types of things, you can use that more sophisticated type of testing for. But when it comes to testing small iterations and small changes to see sort of what kind of small elements of an ad might boost your engagement, you can throw those into a platform and have it sort of test for you.
From the creative standpoint, I would agree with that. I would rather test on incremental optimizations than place the speed at the concepting and sort of thematic development rounds. Like, that's where the time needs to be spent to make sure that it's aligning with the performance strategy, but not the creative strategy, and making sure those are dialed. We get those in the market, we see what they're doing, and then I think the speed comes around the optimization of those creative themes and optimizing and iterating on those to make sure that they are continuing to perform the way they should.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you all for indulging me on that. It was going to drive me nuts and probably our audience too. So yeah, thanks for following us on this long and winding road. And hopefully you learned a lot about creative. Thank you so much for coming on, Tyler, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. This has been The Hypothesis. Thank you so much for tuning in. For show notes or to get in touch, find us at thehypothesisshow.com or at Thrive Digital, both linked for you in our description box. And if you liked today's episode, we'd love if you'd rate and review wherever you're listening or watching. Thanks!